Hey folks, welcome to the Green Root Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Schlossberg, and for this episode, really excited to have Shannon Wilson on. Shannon has been a longtime mentor of mine. I met him out in Eugene, Oregon years ago when I was out there doing ecosystem and forest advocacy. And Shannon is one of those folks who has been in this for the long haul. He's been working to protect ecosystems for decades, and he is still at it. And welcome to the podcast, Shannon.
Thanks, Josh.
Really glad you're here. Basically, let's just start with your background. So in terms of, where you grew up and how you start becoming aware of just environmental issues in general.
Ronald Reagan had just gotten reappointed, and the only reason I was going to college was to get a degree to see if I could try to save places, save wildlands, save ecosystems. And I was completely disillusioned after Ronald Reagan was reappointed in 1984. And subsequent to that, I floated around and I worked for the Rough and Ready Mill for about 4 months before it nearly killed me when I got hit by a 2x6, 12-foot 2x6 off the sorter chain, and it knocked some sense into me, as well as about 20 stitches. And so then I started going back to school, the community college, and I got a degree a 2-year degree in forestry, and lo and behold, out of the blue, I get hired by the Forest Service to do spotted owl surveys. And it was kind of a dream job to me. It's like, wow, I'm actually going to be able to save forests, from being clear cut. And we were basically a crew of 10 spotted owl surveyors in 1990 and 91. And we were, saving thousands of acres of ancient forest from being clear cut, because we were finding pairs of spotted owls in pretty much every old growth forest that they were slated to be logged in our one district, which was like tens of thousands of acres of proposed clear cuts. And by the second year, though, I'm working there and I think, wow, man, I'm going to work for the Forest Service now and do wildlife biology and save forests and stuff like that. So that was where I wanted to go. And lo and behold, some firefighter crew people started telling me about how the district ranger there had used a whole firefighting crew to basically illegally take U-logs that were being harvested and transporting them in Forest Service vehicles, and then hauling them and giving them to a local politician in Douglas County. And I was just like, whoa, that sounds like blatantly illegal. And so, I took that to my supervisor, and he was like, well, it is true. After he said, he looked into it and he says, it is true, but I'm not going to do anything about it. And it says, it's up to you. And so at that point I decided, well, I can't work for this agency if this is the way they do things. Yeah. And I actually called in the whistleblower hotline on this guy and even sent a letter to the supervisor of the Umpqua National Forest and told him, and nothing ever happened. The guy kept his job, probably got a nice retirement 10 years later or whatever, but he was committing felonies, something I would have went to jail for. And so then I moved on from there. I was like, forget it, I can't work for this agency,
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating, because most who call themselves environmentalists have not been a part of the inside of the system. So you were, involved with what logging industry was doing. You're like, well, this is my area. I'm going to see what's going on with that. You're like, all right, I'm done with that. Not for me. You were part of the Forest Service because you wanted to do some good things for the forest. You realized that they were not actually protecting the forest. So you tried to do it through the system, and you realized that the system was not adequate for protecting forests, that it didn't really have that in mind. and you actually tried to call attention to it, you thought, hey, this is what this entity is about, and then they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So where did you go from there? You didn't just give up, obviously.
Well, after that, I decided, well, I need to move to Eugene, get away from, Roseburg, one of the timber capitals of United States. And I figured, Eugene has an activist community. I could probably find, environmental organizations to work with and maybe even get a job with one of them eventually. If I, was dedicated and smart, successful, had the right background. So that's what I did. Moved to Eugene, figuring, I'd plug into what was going on there. I worked for the BLM, doing marbled murrelet, another endangered bird surveys for about 3 seasons. But, I was also going to meetings, and I went to some of my first, environmental meetings, including Earth First, people who were organizing, trying to save forests through, direct action.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So about what year was that?
That was probably between 1990 and 94. And I worked with a bunch of different, more mainstream groups, Oregon Wild, which used to be called the Oregon Natural Resources Council. Mm-hmm. I was hanging out with those folks, going to roadless areas, monitoring timber sales, finding spotted owls if we could. And then, the Northwest Forest Plan happened, and basically, some of these groups compromised and made a deal with Bill Clinton and basically sacrificed half the ancient forest to the logging industry, and then said, oh, well, the other half is for spotted owls, sort of. We'll still be logging in some of those areas that were supposedly set aside for spotted owls, but, but we're still going to be managing some of those areas to increase the speed of which they would become habitat for spotted owl. And, that was more corruption that, I discovered that the local environmental groups were committing as early as, 93 and 94, that they were making deals, letting old growth timber sales, go ahead, lifting their lawsuits and letting timber sales be logged because there was deals to be made with Bill Clinton.
Yep. Well, that's really disappointing, I imagine, at the time. So you went through all these different entities thinking that they would be doing forest protection stuff. You gave up on doing it through the government. You're like, all right, I'm going to be a part of environmental groups. They're the ones who are fighting for the forest. And then you found out, oops, they too are not always doing that with the forest's best interest in mind. So how did that really affect your perspective on the whole environmental movement? How did that influence your actions?
Well, yeah, I tried to work through these different entities thinking, these are legitimate. These people are, dedicated, and want to save things, want to protect things. It's in their mission statement, right? Mm-hmm. But then, as I work within these entities, I find out, well, no, there's something else underlying in there that's doesn't seem quite ethical. Mm. And so, I moved on. I was like, well, Earth first, it's no compromise in defense of Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. And I had actually went to my first Earth First base camp. It was in Idaho. I was going to go to Montana to go visit some friends who moved to Missoula, and some of my old spotted owl survey friends. And I figured, well, there's this Earth First base camp over in this place called Cove Mallard, which was touted as the largest unprotected wild area in the lower 48 states. And the Forest Service had proposed and was actually doing it, logging and building, well, over 100 miles of logging roads into the roadless area, tens of thousands of acres of timber sales that they were logging, and Earth First was in the way, blocking it and, doing direct action. And so I went out there, visited base camp, and, the first day I was out there, I get out there and, I'm in the base camp. There's only like a handful of people. And some people come, some locals, I guess, come driving by on this dead end road. And just a few hundred feet from the base camp, they started shooting their high-powered rifle above our heads, Yeah. And so we all hit the ground, lay on the ground. And, 10 minutes goes by and I guess they double back the other way. But it wasn't enough to scare me off. I stuck around and hiked around the wilderness area for the next couple of days. And I stayed involved with Earth First. And, for the next basically almost 30 years.
Right. So Earth First and then Cascadia Forest Defenders, which was basically an offshoot of Earth First, right?
Yeah. And then, in 1995, Bill Clinton signed the Salvage Logging Rider, which basically suspended all environmental laws in the nation, basically, on national forest and BLM lands to increase logging and log ancient forests that had been stopped by lawsuits, before the Northwest Forest Plan. And so I jumped into that, in 1995, and did that for at least 10 to 15 years, just full time, fighting ancient forest timber sales from that legislation.
Right. Yeah. Well, what's interesting about your career is that you didn't just participate in one aspect of the environmental movement. So you were a part of a lot of the hardcore direct action stuff. So going out into the forests with blockades and things like that and tree sits. But you were also a part of, I wouldn't call it the mainstream component, but, organizing advocacy, stuff that goes into public outreach, things like that, to the point where actually you were a part of something called Many Rivers Group Sierra Club. So you were a part of the Sierra Club. What was your experience with that?
Well, yeah, at the same time I was doing direct action and starting in 1995, I actually had a friend who was part of of the Sierra Club. And he's like, hey, we need some executive committee members that are a little more edgy to be on this local group. And it was called the Many Rivers Group, Sierra Club. And so I joined him in 1995. And, and I was on the executive committee. And eventually I started working with the Oregon chapter Sierra Club. I was one of their state coordinators. I was the in-commercial logging state coordinator for a little bit. I was going to their statewide meetings. Some of the meetings were 2 days or more in length, and, we're trying to, protect wildlands in Oregon is one of them and stop logging. And so, I kept on working both angles within that system, trying to start and, keep my own nonprofit going, as well as working with Cascadia Forest Defenders and, trying to throw up as many tree sits as we could to stop the logging.
Right.
And, we had tree sits for 5 years straight, in one timber sale called Fall Creek. And it was actually, thousands of people, sat in those trees over those 5 years to save those areas. They're still standing, but Forest Service is still trying to log all around them. But yeah, so I was working all these different angles, and Yeah, it was full time, unpaid, but I was really feeling like I was accomplishing things and getting ahead. And basically by 2004, through direct action and lawsuits were being filed too, but we pretty much, the agencies had pretty much given up logging old growth trees. Any tree that was more than 200 years old, they pretty much had withdrawn and said, well, uncle, we give up. We're not going to log old growth trees anymore, at least in Western Oregon and Washington and Northern California. But, they had other plans to start logging all the other trees that are less than 200 years old.
Right.
And so that became the next battle. It's like, okay, you're going to continue to log native forests, but you're just going to leave the big old trees unless they're in the way of logging, of course, which we saw several incidents of that where they said, oh, we're going to leave all the old growth trees. And then we discover after they started logging that they took about half the old growth trees in some of these stands that they said they were going to save.
Right.
And so we threw up another tree sit, think of 2004 in the McKenzie watershed, and that called attention to that. And that was when they finally did give up. It was after that, incident.
Right. Yep. And I was a part of that whole stuff going on in the McKenzie watershed. A lot of us were a part of it. That was back in the day. So before getting into your entity, Eco Advocates Northwest, let's talk a little bit about where your involvement with the Sierra Club went, because what ends up happening a lot of times with these larger organizations is there are folks who are very well-meaning and biocentric, care about the natural world and advocating for it at all costs. They get involved with these large organizations and there's only so much headway they can make. And you had a lot of success with the Many Rivers group, but at a certain point of time there ended up being some conflict. And I think it would be great to hear a little bit about that.
Well, yeah. While I was doing all these other things and bouncing around from timber sale to timber sale, roadless areas, ski resorts, whatever, I was trying to, we were trying to stop these things. And, working through the Sierra Club and using their newsletter and getting the word out statewide about these things going on, because they had a newsletter that went to about 20,000 members across Oregon. And, I would get published in there, and every once in a while, I would expose, Senator Wyden or Peter DeFazio, which is our representative, for promoting logging and destructive policies.
And both Democrats making that point.
Yeah, and the state is a Democratic state for the most part. We've had a Democratic elected governor since probably for the last 34 years. But, the logging hasn't stopped or slowed down. The only reason it did slow down is because of direct action and lawsuits. And it wasn't politicians. The politicians, like Senator Wyden and DeFazio, are still promoting logging and biomass extraction as much as possible. But, I would criticize them in these newsletters. And every once in a while, there'd be some pushback, like, "Oh, you shouldn't have said that," or "How did you get that published?" And, at one point, Oregon chapter was like, "Oh, well, we need to have an editorial board for our newsletter because, people like Shannon are publicly critical of Democratic, politicians that, like Senator Wyden and DeFazio, and we got to keep an eye on people like that."
Yep.
So, I was getting some pushback, but I still didn't stop doing it. And then, the election came about in around 2008. I became the chair of the Many Rivers group. And, I started getting op-eds published critical of the governor and other politicians for promoting forest biomass incineration. they were trying to push this statewide. They were saying Oregon was the Saudi Arabia of forest biomass
Right.
energy, and we're going to make it that, and I pushed back by getting op-eds published, and then started hearing some rumblings from, some staff in Portland, Sierra Club staff. They were saying, well, we were getting some context from Carl Pope and such that, to keep an eye on me. And that was around 2008.
So Carl Pope, he was the head of Sierra Club at the time. National.
Yeah, he was the executive director of the National Sierra Club. And he, directed staff. There was Sierra Club staff in Portland. And so, I was like, well, whatever, And then, by 2009, and 10, all of a sudden, the Many Rivers, certain people in the Many Rivers group seemed like they were making moves to try to get rid of people who supported me within the group. And then by 2010, they actually ousted me as the chair. And the actual Oregon chapter leader came to our meeting, traveled from Portland to Eugene to make sure that I was removed.
Yeah.
By attending that meeting and manipulating it so that, one member who tried to vote over phone, who had the flu and couldn't come to the meeting, disqualified his vote, which I thought was against the bylaws. But, I was just like, I just walked out. I said, forget this. I spent 15 years with the Sierra Club, trying to make Sierra Club the most effective, forest protection entity in Oregon. And this is my payment, to be thrown out because I'm critical of Democratic politicians who are, promoting destruction of our last ancient forests.
Well, because that's the thing. There's a big difference between the leadership, a lot of these groups, and then leadership at the local level and then the membership. So you were abiding by the things that need to happen in an environmental group, basically following in the footsteps of David Brower, who, for folks who don't know him, he was the most legendary environmentalist ever. He really popularized the Sierra Club back in the day, and then they got rid of him. And that's basically a badge of honor, is when the Sierra Club kicks you out. And a lot of it, seemed to be about your critique of Democrats who are supposed to be the pro-environmental party. And it turns out sometimes they're a little bit better, but in many times they're worse. Like you said, Senator Ron Wyden, he's been one of the biggest advocates for biomass energy in the country. So that's, cutting forests for energy. It's coming from a Democrat. So do you see more and more that a lot of these environmental groups, the larger environmental groups for the most part, they're kind of just mouthpieces or auxiliaries of the Democratic Party?
Well, I don't even know what Democratic Party represents. Other than, business as usual, but in a softer way with the rhetoric of like, oh, we're for the environment, but at least, in their rhetoric. But when it comes down to it, what are they actually doing to protect anything? Mm-hmm. They're still promoting logging of ancient forest here. Senator Wyden just is introducing a bill right now to garner about $100 million of new money for more logging on national forests and for more biomass incineration.
Right. Actively
right now. And then, Representative Peter DeFazio a few years ago promoted or sponsored a bill to basically privatize over 1 million acres of public land for the timber industry. I mean, that didn't really go anywhere, but more recently he just gave away 33,000 acres thereof of public land to tribal governments that basically derive all their money from logging, clear cutting. And so it's like, well, these people, these so-called environmental democratic leaders are doing more destruction and they're not really protecting anything.
And they're doing it under the cover of being pro-environmental.
Right.
So they can do some of the same things that a Republican would do, but either they get applause for it or just nobody comes out in opposition, or no environmentalists do, rather.
Right. No mainstream bigger environmental group is going to come out and publicly criticize Senator Wyden or Peter DeFazio or probably any other Democrat because, I mean, they're all in this one big cabal. You know, it's like, oh, well, you know, we scratch your back, I'll scratch yours. And, you know, and like, you know, when DeFazio gave away this 33,000 acres, he also simultaneously protected this area outside Eugene of about 30,000 acres as wilderness. But the area that was protected was never under any threat of being logged because it's full of marble murrelets that are protected species, endangered species, northern spotted owls, and coho salmon. And so this area was never even threatened anytime soon of being, you know, destroyed or degraded. But yet now the environmentalists get to crow about, oh, look, we got a wilderness over here. Please give us more money and support and blah, 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 blah. Aren't we wonderful? And they're totally silent on this other quid pro quo of 33,000 acres being given to the timber industry in Douglas County.
Yeah, and it's that sleight of hand that's very common in a lot of the mainstream environmental movement. You know, what's also common is, look, we protected this wilderness that's all what they call rocks and ice. So it's like, it's not necessarily even commercially viable for logging anyway. And like, look, we protected it. And it's like, well, the logging industry didn't even want that because there are not enough merchantable logs there. So yeah, that kind of thing is very common. Most folks don't know about that. And continuing on that theme of mainstream environmental movement kind of selling out the environmental movement, this film Planet of the Humans recently came out that talks a lot about that, and it doesn't focus as much on forest issues. It does a little bit like the biomass issue and a few other things, but the fact that this film has come out, and it came out on a very large platform, which is Michael Moore's platform. The film was written and directed by Jeff Gibbs, who is a longtime producer of Michael Moore, and Michael Moore obviously has a lot of clout and influence. So they put it out on YouTube less than a month ago, and it's already gotten 8 million views. And the response from a lot of the public has been very positive, kind of like, wow, I didn't realize the environmental movement was not really always advocating for the environment, things like that. But a lot of the mainstream environmental movement that's critiqued in this, they have gone ballistic. And I guess I'd be curious just to hear maybe a little bit about your thoughts on the film. We don't need to go super in depth with that. I've talked about that a bit on the podcast before, but your thoughts on that, and maybe thoughts on the mainstream environmental movement's reaction to the film.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've heard about this film from a friend of mine, Michael Donnelly, for the last couple of years, that he had a friend that was working on this, and you know, we were like, wow, it sounds great. Let's wait to see what it comes out. And we had no idea what it was really going to be about. But then, and then recently we learned that, oh yeah, now it's ready out. It's ready to be out. It's finished. And that was back in the fall. And we're like, well, maybe we can get it shown at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, which is touted as the biggest environmental law conference in the world, or at least was, where thousands of people from all over the world and country show up to talk about protecting the environment by using environmental law. And you know, we thought, well, maybe we can get a venue to show the movie. And so, you know, Michael Donnelly pursues that, and then, you know, and I'm ready to jump on board to help promote it. And then suddenly it's like, oh, well, the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference doesn't want to set up a venue to have the movie shown at their event. And they usually always have venues for movies.
Yep.
I mean, multiple movies during this. It's like a 3 or 4 day event, conference.
And they've and they've had some pretty controversial speakers. I won't get into that, but it's not like they have always shied away from anything that's potentially controversial. But for this, they're like, nope, not going to show the film. Fascinating.
Well, yeah. So, Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, it's changed a lot since I first attended. I first attended back in, 92, 93, and David Brower would show up, as the keynote speaker, the commencement speaker every year, for years and years. And, always looked forward to seeing David Brower.
Yep.
And then, it got really big in the late 90s. The conference did. And they had some really radical speakers there, like Paul Watson and Winona LaDuke and others, really inspiring people.
Yeah. And
but as of late, it's become more controlled by the climate movement, or whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. They had people like James Hansen there recently, and occasionally Bill McKibben will speak, but it's usually via Skype or something like that.
Yeah.
But then, it all became more like climate focused, and suddenly the law conference was more about certain entities that were in control of who could present there and what panels, were allowed,
And just to interject really quickly, you don't think that, you'd think that climate change is an issue worth dealing with, of course, right?
Oh yeah, of course. Protecting the forest is a pivotal mitigation measure to deal with climate.
Right.
And in fact, we put on a conference back in 2008 talking about clear cutting and climate.
Yep.
And to this day, really, the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference and most of the Oregon environmental groups haven't even taken that on in a serious way.
Yeah, the website's still up. Mark Rabinowitz has the website forestclimate.org. So it actually has some clips from that conference where we tied together forest protection and climate change. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point, because you're not saying, oh, the climate movement isn't doing anything. You're saying that the climate movement is being really myopic with just focusing on one aspect of the eco crisis, and that tends to subvert certain aspects like forest protection and other things.
Yeah. So, it's to me, it's okay, well, the bigger environmental or climate movement isn't really even paying attention to the logging of ancient forests around the world. They're putting all their eggs into we're just gonna, promote electric cars and giant windmills and solar farms and all these technologies, but how many resources are they focusing on saving ancient forests? They're still logging ancient forests right here, just a few miles away from my home. Mm-hmm. They're still logging, down in Southern Oregon, everywhere. Anywhere there's national forests and big trees, sure. There's still timber sales being produced, thousands of acres of timber sales by these agencies. And the climate movement is well, we don't really know what to do, and we're just going to focus on, all these technologies, promoting that.
But that's not it, right? They're not only are they not working on the forest protection issue, a lot of those folks have been advocating for cutting trees for biomass energy for years, or at the very least just kind of leaving the door open for it without saying a thing. And that was my involvement with Planet of the Humans, right? I'm in the clip about the impacts of biomass energy, cutting trees for electricity and transportation fuels and heating as well. And Shannon was actually the first person who turned me on to the issues with biomass energy. It was back when I was in Oregon working for Native Forest Council, and also part of your organization, Shannon, Eco Advocates Northwest, and you called attention to these understory clear cuts. So basically what they call thinning of forests. So they're not necessarily cutting the biggest trees, but they're going into a lot of native forest stands and other forest stands. They're cutting out trees and they are using them for energy. So the climate movement has been a big, frankly, an advocate of that. Bill McKibben for years was a big advocate, and he has changed his tune to a certain degree on that. But a lot of the reason why it was really difficult for us to call attention to those issues was because so many of the big environmental leaders were advocating for it. So I just wanted to interject that. But yeah, keep going with what you were saying. So the climate movement, they become basically focused on just alternative energy tech. And before getting into that, why don't you talk a little bit about your involvement with solar, because you are no stranger to solar energy.
Yeah. I mean, back in when I was a teenager, I mean, when Jimmy Carter started talking about solar and all that stuff, I was like, wow, great. That sounds like, like magic or something. So I got really involved in it. I was even part of the solar lobby back in the early 80s, trying to stop Ronald Reagan, from taking all the funding from the solar energy and wind energy research budgets, which he did every year while he was, president. And but yeah, I studied it, and then, at some point I decided, well, maybe I want to go into the energy field. So after the Forest Service, I learned about the Forest Service corruption and BLM corruption, that I couldn't work within those agencies. Mm-hmm. I actually went back to school for, a couple of years, community college, and got a degree in energy management, and kind of focused on alternative energy or renewable energies like solar and wind, because that's where I really wanted to go into. In the meantime, I was still doing forest defense stuff, but trying to look ahead and going, maybe someday, I'll get into the energy field and make a living that way, because I feel like that's another way I can help the planet, help the biosphere, help other species, is like lessening our impact to ecosystems and species. Mm-hmm. But, I've used solar electricity in various, small little projects, and even installed my own, a small system, 1.5 kilowatts or 1,500 watt system, mm-hmm. which is not a lot, but, it's pretty damn expensive. Yep. I mean, it was like, about $10,000 just for a little 1.5 kilowatt system. And so, I monitored it and all this stuff, and, what it was actually doing, how much output it was putting out, how much energy it was displacing. And, I'm in Eugene, Oregon, and it's like, we don't get a lot of sun. I mean, in the summer, we get a lot of sun for 3 or 4 months, but the rest of the year it's like cloudy, drizzly, rainy, and in the winter solar here in the winter probably generates maybe 15% of what it would generate in the peak of the summer, mm-hmm. Because the sun is so low in the winter, and the cloudy conditions and rainy conditions. Right. So it's I learned through experience that solar it works for some things, but it's not going to power our entire civilization and our way of life. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many solar panels you can put up to like, and of course, solar panels, you can't grow food with solar panels. I mean, you can't, right. Solar panels don't make fertilizer. Solar panels can't transport food thousands of miles from farms. Sure. So, electricity is kind of a privilege or a luxury, and I think it should be used that way, because it's a finite resource, and we should be, a lot more better at managing and using it more efficiently, right, before we, throw up giant mega wind farms and giant mega solar farms all over the planet. So, as far as that's where I agree with Planet of the Humans, it's like, we can't just build our way out of this with all this technology, because all this technology takes extraction of billions of tons of rare metals, you know, mining, strip mining, and they're even talking about strip mining the seabed, the oceans, to attain the metals like copper and cobalt and nickel to build all this so-called green infrastructure. Right. I call it green industrialism. But, you know, they just want to say, oh, well, we're going to replace all our coal and natural gas, allegedly, right. Which I don't think is ever going to happen. But at least coal, they're like, oh, well, we're going to replace all the coal with, you know, solar and wind and blah, blah, blah. But you've got to mine billions of tons of all these rare metals to do it.
Right.
And they already acknowledged that there's not enough metals on land surfaces to do what they are planning to do, that they actually have to strip mine the ocean beds to do this. It's insane.
Well, that's the footprint, and that's a lot of the critique in Planet of the Humans, and it seems like your critique is we have to be aware of what the footprint is for these technologies and decide whether they're doing more harm than good or more good than harm. I mean, you would say that some community scale solar is, you know, probably part of the equation, right?
Well, I would say, you know, where the infrastructure can handle it, because, you know, the power lines are only so thick, right? They can only carry so much, you know, electricity, electrons, before, you know, you could overload your transformers, and, you know, and there you lose, you know, your efficiencies, or you blow up the system, you blow up your transformers. Like I've heard in Hawaii, there's so many people doing solar that they have to basically, because they have, you know, less infrastructure there, that the power lines are actually not as, you know, heavy as, you know, say in the States. So they have to limit the amount of solar electric systems they can have on the grid, because it can overload the grid.
Interesting. The
small grids they have. So, you know, there's only so far you can go, but yeah, take advantage where the grid is large and can handle things like that without destroying habitat. You know, like rooftops, right, and warehouses, parking lots, you know, maybe stuff like that. But, you know, beyond that, I don't know. Maybe some on near dams. I've heard about floating solar, which is basically putting solar panels in the middle of bodies of water, reservoirs or lakes, which is, you know, there's really no footprint. I mean, you're probably going to affect wildlife like waterfowl, right? But I don't know. I haven't seen any studies to you know, say this is the impact, because there's not a lot of them out there, at least in the United States.
Right. Well, particularly reservoirs are also not even natural bodies of water, so they're already kind of weird places anyway. Might as well make use of them. Well, because I wanted to make the point between there's community scale and industrial scale, and I think it's very interesting because those who are big advocates for, you know, all forms of alternative energy, which a lot of times is way more than solar and wind, it's biomass, big hydro, those sorts of things. They're not talking as much about this community scale, and it's like, why don't we maximize that first before trying to make these mega facilities? You know, I'm still learning more about it and the impacts and stuff like that, but it's interesting. It's like, why we're not doing all those smaller things. We don't really hear the environmental groups talk as much about that. It seems like they just want to put their basket in the industrial scale stuff. So that seems to be a lot of the controversy around Planet of the Humans. Are saying, oh, well, this film came out and it says never build a solar panel. And I don't think that's what it says, but it's very interesting that that's what people turn the discussion into. But what other aspects of Planet of the Humans resonate with you?
Well, like I said before, yeah, I really appreciate that they're pointing out that, you know, you can't just build our way out of this, you know, catastrophe that we've created over the last 150 years, ever since we discovered fossil fuels, especially liquid fossil fuels, we've become completely dependent on liquid fossil fuels to expand, our population, expand our footprint, expand our cities, our agricultural system. So, it's just like we've overshot the planet's capacity to repair itself, to to handle our footprint, to handle 7 billion people,
right,
and all our agriculture to feed 7 billion people. And so it's, to me, it's like, yeah, we need to think about, okay, what are our basic necessities? What do we really just need, not just want? It's like food, water, shelter, healthcare, happiness, whatever that is. It's like, making your way through your life by being productive and being part of your community and helping your community.
Right.
To me, those are the basics that we should be thinking about. We shouldn't like all these other things are, like, to me, luxuries. The hospitality industry, it's like, airline travel and restaurants and hotels and cruise ships and shopping at the mall. All those things are luxuries. And when it comes down to it, it's like we need to think about, what do we really just need, and where are we going if we don't change that perspective? I mean, we're quickly going into the realm of our own extinction, if we don't just get back to just maintaining the basics for our own survival and for the biosphere's survival. Because there's we've been saying this for decades. There's no jobs on a dead planet. There's no equality for anybody on a dead planet.
Right.
That's the bottom line. There's no human life on a dead planet. There's no school on a dead planet. There's nothing on it. It's like, that's what we have to think about, I think, day after day, when we make decisions on, where should I, do with my life?
Right.
Should I be benefiting my community, or should I just be looking out for myself, to obtain the newest car or the latest gadget? There's certain things that we need, that we've gotten accustomed to, that we like having in our life, but maybe we can think a little more deeply about, what is the impact of that action or buying that thing to our future, to, future generations, to other life on this planet that is just as deserving as humans to exist on this planet with us.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the deep critique of Planet of the Humans is the aspect that a lot of these mainstream environmentalists and folks in the climate movement object to. It's not the fact that they pointed out some of the negative environmental footprint of alternative energy. It was more that here are limitations to this. So even if solar and wind are, do no damage, which of course they do. Right now I believe it's solar is at like 1.8% of electricity, and wind is I can't remember if it's like between 7 and 10, something like that. But that's not very much, and electricity is 38% of energy use. So that's still not very much. Clearly, we have to go deeper. And the Green Root podcast, why I wanted to create this, is to be able to talk about some of those root causes. And you hit the nail on the head with what you were saying. And I think that's what is also in Planet of the Humans. Like, we got to take a deeper look at, so why are we demanding all of this energy? And why are we doing all of this environmental destruction? Because it's not just about our energy. Even if we got that taken care of, we're still consuming every resource on the planet. And all of that is finite, and we are expanding infinitely. So I really personally think, and I'd be curious what you think, I think that's why environmentalists, mainstream environmentalists, are so sensitive about the film, is because it's talking about those kind of uncomfortable issues that they've largely been leaving off of their agenda. I mean, here and there they'll say, oh, turn off a light switch, and yeah, that's good, but that's not the kind of deep level change that you and I and Planet of the Humans have been talking about.
No. And, I've heard for years, in various circles, even in the especially energy management circles, that, when Jimmy Carter back in the 70s when he was president asked people, he went on TV and asked people, put on a sweater if you feel cold, don't turn up the thermostat, and and maybe drive less, or just be mindful about how you're using things, and maybe just do without a little bit.
Right.
And they throw that out. It's like, oh, well, that was a terrible thing to do. You can't ask people to make sacrifices for others, or to be whatever, do without.
Right.
And I think the whole environmental movement, for the most part, especially the mainstream environmental movement, has refused to go down that road of asking people and saying, hey, no, we can't have it all. It's like they will not say that. They will not tell people the truth. What it comes down to, because they don't think that people can handle the truth. And yeah, maybe a certain percentage of people can handle, like, look, this pandemic, certain percentage of people can't handle the truth. They just go out and like, oh, whatever, mask, I don't care, whatever.
Right.
It's like, I'm not infected and I'm not going to get it. And, they didn't want to live in the state of denial. Yeah. But the truth is, yeah, we're heading towards extinction. And none of the environmental groups want to even touch human extinction at all. I've never heard anyone say it.
I mean, some people obviously are saying it, but not in the mainstream.
Well, yeah, who's saying it?
Yeah.
I mean, Naomi Klein's not saying it. Noam Chomsky isn't saying it. They all tiptoe around it.
Right.
Chris Hedges, all these people, they've got a lot of people listening to them. But they will not say it. It's like, well, if they say it, that means, well, as soon as they say it, are they blacklisted? Will they never get a book published again or an article published again once they start talking the truth?
Well,
the unpleasant truth that's like that we're heading towards human extinction?
Right.
I mean, the film kind of touches on that when you first, the first intro to the film is like, how long do you think the human species has on this planet? It's like right there.
Yeah. And some people said forever. The woman in the bar, drinking, carousing at the bar, she's like, oh, forever. And it's like, oh, yeah?
But, I think we have to say, okay, this is where we're going. How do we prevent that? What do we have to do to prevent our own extinction? That should be pretty much the basic, question.
Well, do you think that this pandemic has at least gotten certain people to maybe wake up a little bit? I'm not talking about most people. I'm saying, because we don't need everyone on board. We need enough folks who are moving forward in a similar direction to call attention to stuff. So do you think that some people more are like, wow, the system as we thought it is not as stable as we thought. And, it doesn't seem like Corona is going to kill everyone in the world, but it's a harbinger of what could come in terms of more pandemics, of course, but perhaps things that are even more concerning, such as runaway climate change or just ecosystem collapse. So do you think people are maybe right now in a more susceptible mindset for thinking about these issues?
I don't know. I mean, yeah, probably the realization that, the system is pretty fragile, the way we've constructed it over the last, say, 100 years, maybe 50 years, even more so because of technology. Cell phones, computers, are pretty much in control of everything. And, of course, people are supposedly, there to fix things and fix glitches when they happen. But yeah, I think they are more open to hearing new ideas of like, well, the old system is pretty much failed.
Yeah.
Capitalism and the whole, oh, well, if it's profitable, then it's beneficial to society because, otherwise, they wouldn't do it, right? But it's failed. The capitalist system has failed. I mean, if a system is driving your own species into extinction, wouldn't you call that failure? I mean, that's what we're looking at. I mean, the capitalist system and other systems have kind of been competing with capitalism in a similar way, authoritarian, it's like, oh yes, we're going to, but now China has taken a form of capitalism, more like a communist type of capitalism, or authoritarian type capitalism, and is pushing their own, hey, we're going to do better than or bigger than the United States, and we're going to destroy as much, if not more, of the world than you guys did, what's left of it anyway, to attain our, whatever, as the empire of the world.
Right.
So it's all going down the same road, but it's just like, if that system has failed, or is, if we end up going extinct, isn't that a failure of those systems?
I would say so, yeah. Well, that's what I appreciate about your analysis, because even though you have that deep ecology perspective, everything tying back to that foundation of everything, which is our ecosystems that keep us alive, you do talk about things like economic systems and then also social issues like poverty and war and how that all ties in. So would you be willing to talk a little bit about how the environmental movement can't just operate in some bubble? It also has to look at things like militarism and things like that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I grew up pretty much in poverty. I mean, I grew up on food stamps and barely getting by every month, as far as my parents and everything, in Southern Oregon. So I know what poverty feels like. I've eaten out of dumpsters, when I was going to college or trying to go to college in Eugene, just to survive. But yeah, and I've always never been very patriotic, I guess you would call it. I've never been a supporter of the military.
You're an ecosystem patriot, though, right?
Right, but I've never been maybe it's some influences after learning about the Vietnam War and things like that, where I've always kind of been anti-militaristic in some respect, but and always just saw like, oh, the military, well, it's like, it's just an industry, that's pretty much taken over America. That's where most our funding goes from our taxes, is to build bigger and better weapons to kill each other or to dominate other nations or to be the supreme empire. And so it's just, insanity. And then the more I learned about Martin Luther King and why he was murdered, because he took on the military industrial complex, and he took it on head on, and, they couldn't have that. So they took him out. And then Robert F. Kennedy was probably going to go down the same road. And so they saw that threat and took him out. And JFK, probably the same thing, So it was way before my time, but the more I learned about what they were trying to do and take back the country from the military industrial complex and the real deep state, which is, military deep state, who's really in control of things, the empire, with, the elite kind of somewhere in the mix, calling the shots. But yeah, so it's like here we are, 50 some years after Martin Luther King and all that, and we still haven't taken back our country from the military industrial complex.
Right.
And yet they're getting more and more money to build, bigger bombs and more powerful bombs. And now we're going to have a space force, right? We're going to, whatever,
Supposedly.
have satellites that are going to control the world. If you get out of line and piss off the United States, we're going to zap you with our satellite or something. So now China wants to we can't have the United States be the space force. We got to have our own space force. Yikes. So here's another arms race, in the meantime, our whole biosphere is collapsing around us, collapsing, the oceans are getting ready basically to collapse. Ecosystems are collapsing around us. And yet we have all these resources we're going to waste on building bombs and spaceships and sending people to Mars or whatever.
Right.
It's insane. It's like you know the direction we're heading, but yet you totally ignore it. And this is another thing that these social and environmental so-called movements will not address. No one's really even talking about it.
Yeah.
There's a few small groups here and there, fringe groups, and all the other big multi-million-dollar groups are like, no, we're on our own little hamster wheel, and
right.
It pays well, and we're collecting hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever to keep our foundation, our entities running, and so everything's fine. We're not going to touch, these bigger picture issues, like why are we spending $1 trillion or more every year on weapons when we could be spending those resources protecting ecosystems, protecting frontline communities, cleaning them up, giving people jobs, actually protecting their communities and making their communities more resilient to whatever it is, pandemics, climate change, catastrophic events, governments failing. It's like, why aren't we taking those resources from where it's being wasted and put it to support our community, our human community,
right?
Worldwide, not just in this country, but worldwide.
Yeah, well, those are the cross-pollination things that we need to be doing, that most of these groups, let's say they're focused on environmental and climate, and they're very narrowly even focused on that. So they're not even looking at the whole environmental issue, much less how it ties into all these other aspects. So yeah, I do appreciate that analysis, because we have to look at things that way. We can't just look at one part of the elephant, or whatever the phrasing is. So, and a lot of people do point like, well, where are we going to have the funding for that? It's like, well, maybe taking it out of the budget for military. And it's like, well, why do we have such a high budget for military? Well, a lot of it is to commandeer resources for the American way of life. So it all kind of comes back into focus that way, right?
Right. Well, yeah, it's like the elite in the real deep state, the military deep state, CIA, NSA, whatever. Who knows what other agencies are out there that we don't even know exist, but right. Especially around the world. But it's basically the empire has to maintain access to resources to maintain its empire.
Yep.
So how does it do that? Well, we have armies, militaries, and anyone gets out of line and says, flips the finger to us and says, yeah, we're not going to play ball with you. We're going to be, and the United States was like, whoa, what? We'll just come on over there and take you over. Sure. Like we did in Panama, and where else? Well, we took out the Libya leader because he wouldn't play ball. We planned on of course, Saddam. We were like, oh, you want to play ball with us? We'll just come over and take you out. Now it's Venezuela, right? Like, you want to play ball? Well, we're gonna just we'll get you eventually. We'll take you out. Yeah. We're working on it. So she's out. That's the way empires operate, but. It's just, but the people who go along with it, and to me, when these large nonprofit entities, whether you're an environmental group or social justice group,
Mm-hmm.
if you just go along to get along, you're part of the problem. You're not part of the solution.
Yeah, well, if you trace the funding, a lot of it, if not all of it, is from large foundations, and those are corporate funded foundations. So that's where the money comes from. It comes from energy corporations or other individuals who have been a part of that. And you think that those foundations are going to want to fund efforts that will basically harm their, milk cows? It's just unlikely to happen. But so one of the critiques of Planet of the Humans is that it doesn't offer solutions. And personally, I don't think its purpose was to, and in a 100-minute film, like, you're only going to get to so much. I think personally the point of it was to reframe the problem, because the mainstream environmental movement has obfuscated it to a certain degree. So now that we're reframing the problem, what's kind of the way forward in your mind? Because that's what I feel like this film is doing. And it's interesting because it's saying, okay, here's the problem. How do we move forward with it? The mainstream environmental movement is basically saying, the film is lies and don't watch it, and have tried to prevent people from watching it. So for those of us, we can critique them until the cows come home. My second cow analogy. We can keep critiquing the mainstream environmental movement, and that's totally legitimate to do so. But I think more important is that we move forward with what we should be doing instead, and taking some of the momentum from Planet of the Humans, which is either waking up some folks or for the first time, people who are saying, wow, I'm now caring about the environmental stuff, and they're kind of bypassing the whole mainstream stuff. So I know you have an organization, Eco Advocates Northwest. eco-advocates.org is the website. So you're continuing with doing all sorts of work on ecosystem advocacy. But what is the general way forward? Like, how should those of us who care about environmental issues and threats to ecosystems and human civilization or humanity itself, on all the species on the planet, what should we be doing?
Well, I really look at myself more of as a biospheric advocate or an antibody, trying to prevent, a cancer from destroying the host, that we live on,
Yeah.
or we couldn't live without. But with no resources, you can only do so much.
Right.
So you have to stay local, I guess, in some respects. And if you see something national, international, maybe, try to expose it to the world and say, hey, look, like this deep sea ocean bed mining for, electric cars and giant windmills. It's like, okay, it's not really out there very much, but, least I can do is try to get it out there to the rest of the world. And so I think that's what Jeff Gibbs and the other, and Michael Moore, of course, were trying to do. It's just like, only have so many resources. What is the biggest bang for the buck? What can we produce that, would kind of expose this green industrialist delusion that's being promoted by environmental groups and the industries that, are going to make billions off all this stuff, like Elon Musk and the rest. And, expose it to the world. But yeah, they didn't really focus on, because they didn't have the time.
Sure.
And I think they don't really have, I don't think they want to say that they have all the answers either, because I don't think anyone does, any one person or entity. But, maybe, set the stage where people like us who see this, as almost destructive, if not more destructive than the first industrialization of, like this would be the second wave of industrialization, but calling it green, first wave would be the last 200 years of fossil fuel industrialization. So now they want to turn it into a green industrialization that's not based on fossil fuels, which is never going to happen. but it's the delusion that's the propaganda that they're pushing. But yeah, so, people like us who see what's coming on and coming down the road, getting together as some sort of coalition or alliance, as antibodies to this cancer and delusion, and hopefully gaining some momentum, working together, and finding. I think direct action has to be a part of it, obviously, because most of the very successful things that I've been involved in campaigns involves direct action.
Right.
It's kind of a pivotal tactic to accomplish your goal. And, I think we do have to look at that tactic as pivotal in our direction to attain that goal. But how do we get there? I hope we can get together as a movement, bring in 350 and others want to talk about this stuff seriously deal with it, then great, join us. We've tried joining you and trying to get through to you, but these groups are almost impossible to get through to. They're just they got the gatekeepers, and there's oh no, unless you're on our platform, we don't have anything to do with you.
Yep. Yep. I 100% agree with that. As somebody who has tried to work within a lot of these entities, and because some of the critique of Planet of the Humans and some of the critique of folks like us who critique these groups are saying, oh, you're being, it was too much. Why do you need to go crapping on them? It's because we've been trying to talk to you guys about these issues for decades, and you ignore us, you silence us, you slander us, you go after our funding. So I think Planet of the Humans was sorry, buddy, we're going to go for the jugular. And, I think there's some legitimate critique in terms of, all right, are we going to just be able to beat up on people? And no, the answer is let's, make a critique and then move forward, like you said, and then saying, hey, do you all want to hitch on to what's happening? Because I think you'd probably agree to a certain extent, Shannon, that a lot of big environmental groups, they're these huge ships that can't really steer very quickly. So there's all these smaller entities, which you can call kayaks. And this analogy is not going to make a lot of sense, but they're able to no, we're going to do this now. And all of a sudden, when they go in that direction, some of these environmental groups, they'll kind of come along to that. A lot of the environmental groups were pro natural gas, right? And then the grassroots anti-fracking movement came and said, well, not so much. Now the mainstream environmental movement is basically just almost entirely no fossil fuels, no fracking, which sure, I'm on board with that, but they're opening the door to nuclear power and biomass energy. And now they're they love biomass energy. And now they're oh, we don't love that anymore. It's yeah, because the grassroots pointed out how not cool it is. So correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is we all need to forge a path forward and then have the larger environmental groups follow us.
Well, yeah. I mean, the bottom line again comes down to okay, it's they don't want to confront this American dream lifestyle. They don't want to say point blank that it's unsustainable and it's driving our own extinction. They refuse to even touch it. And but it's got to be, someone's got to talk about this, or everybody's got to talk about it, really, because that's what it's coming down to. It's there's so many of us on this planet, and more want to use more and more resources that the planet just can't sustain any longer.
Sure.
Or maybe it never could after we reached a certain population and lifestyles. But, and to me, it's, again, back to what are the bare necessities, food, water, shelter, healthcare, and making your way through life, supporting your community. Hopefully you would get compensated for that, but I don't think there's any room for billionaires in that kind of world, or trillionaires, who can, hoard unbelievable amounts of money, more money than a lot of countries have.
Yep.
And, but yeah, so, it's like we need these bigger groups, the environmental groups, to deal with that situation, to deal with that, the elephant in the room. It's like, okay, can we have a livable planet and everyone live like kings and queens?
Right.
Like we do in the United States and Europe?
Yep.
I've used the analogy before, the king and queen of England in the 1930s and 40s, they didn't have anything close to the lifestyle that you and I have access to.
Yep.
They couldn't jump on an airline plane and fly around the world. They didn't have any food they wanted from anywhere in the world, any time of day and night.
Yep.
They didn't have all the technologies, our computers, our TVs, our high-tech cars, it's just on and on and on. We just live so extravagantly, but we kind of take it for granted.
Yes.
Right now, that we can just do whatever we want when we want. But, it's just, we have to address that if we want to survive as a species.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And, in my mind, it's also looking at the positive aspects of how a simpler lifestyle can actually benefit the individual and the community. It can actually be kind of nice to just chill out and not consume. I think a lot of folks are seeing that during the stay-at-home public health orders, where they're not out there constantly consuming and trying to get stimulation. They're just kind of hanging out a bit. And a lot of people are realizing this more contemplative, simpler lifestyle, even though it's not going to be permanent in this regard, is actually a good thing. It's a positive thing for our psychological well-being. It could be our physical health. I mean, some people are suffering more than others, but I think it's a little taste of how we can possibly do things slightly differently, at least give it a try and realize it might be even better for our mental health.
Oh yeah, I think it can be. I don't know, the situation now is necessarily, because most people are living in anxiety of, how they're going to get by, or make their mortgage payment, or
not die. Of course.
Or not get sick when they're forced to work. And I think that's another essential thing. The movements, or climate movement, whatever, they're not really reaching out to these, the grunts, the workers out there who are doing all the dirty grunt work.
Right.
Making our society, function.
Right.
From day to day,
Very true.
And unions have pretty much been busted up since, especially since Ronald Reagan took over, and I think, it would, we really need to be in the same, what could I say, like say we're in the same boat, it's like, the workers in the planet, it's like, how do we bring them into our realm, and assure them that we're not trying to take things away from them,
right,
that they may need or want. I mean, when you say, oh yeah, we can't burn fossil fuels anymore, and blah 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 blah, and you can't drive your, it's like, well, you're kind of targeting the poorest people, because you're saying, well, we're going to make you pay more for gasoline, because we're going to tax it, or put a carbon tax on it. And and the right wing is going to go, well, they're going to put the burden on poor people, which the Republicans obviously don't care about that, but they'll use it.
Sure.
So how do we bring them in with us and say, hey, we're offering you and your family, a better life,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't, as the environmental movement, I don't think has ever bridged that gap.
Not really. Certainly not the mainstream. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, and I think that's some of the critique of the Democratic Party is it doesn't reach out to the working class. So I think all of that needs to be addressed. I think that's totally spot on. But we'll probably wrap things up, Shannon. It's been really great to have you on the podcast. And yeah, the Green Root podcast, it's all about these deeper discussions of going into the root of how we need to be thinking, the issues that we need to take a look at and how to take a look at them. And you've been central to this for decades, and you've opened my eyes to a lot of this. So let folks know that you can check out what Shannon's doing at eco-advocates.org. You're on Facebook too, right? Eco Advocates Northwest. And on Twitter, Eco Advocates Northwest, your handle is Suga _Wilson, TSUGA _Wilson. Or anything else you want to say to folks?
Well, I'd just like to say, appreciate the time that you took to get me onto this technology. But there's also on my website, I have a list of mitigation measures.
Nice.
That there's probably like 40 or 50 of them that some would probably think are pretty extreme, like, no more highway or airport expansions, mm-hmm. and doing away with airline travel, at least non-essential travel, things like that. Mm-hmm. Not building cars at all at some point in the future, because I think we have enough cars on the planet, yeah. And we can do with what we have probably for the next 50 years without building new cars or new airplanes. Mm-hmm. And especially the military-industrial complex, we don't need any more weapons of mass destruction on this planet. Mm-hmm. So there's a list of things there you might want to check out. It's called the Green Real Deal, mm-hmm. and mitigation measures that might prevent our own extinction.
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now. Yeah, the Green Real Deal as opposed to the Green New Deal, which, the Green New Deal was a term that was being used for years, and they just took it for the latest thing. Some good stuff, some not so good. But yeah, this is going to deep level stuff, so folks should definitely check that out. And thanks again for coming on the podcast, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Thank you, Josh.